When the cocky rookie looked Michael Jordan straight in the eye and declared that the six-time NBA champion wasn't relevant anymore, he had no idea he was about to witness greatness that would haunt him for the rest of his career. What happened next on that basketball court became the stuff of legend, a reminder that some fires never truly die, they just wait for the right moment to ignite. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today, because this tale spans across the globe and reminds us all why respect is earned, not given. The year was 2002, and the Washington Wizards' practice facility buzzed with an energy that hadn't been felt in years. The hardwood floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, reflecting the faces of players who were still trying to process the reality of their situation. Michael Jordan, the man who had become synonymous with basketball excellence, had returned to the game after a 3-year retirement. At 39 years old, his knees creaked with the memory of countless battles, his back ached from carrying the weight of championships, and his hands bore the scars of clutch shots that had decided the fate of seasons. Yet there he stood, lacing up his sneakers with the same methodical precision that had once terrorized opponents across the league. The practice gym itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Banners from Jordan's Chicago Bulls days weren't hanging here, but everyone knew what those 6 championship rings represented. The walls had witnessed countless hours of preparation, strategy sessions, and the dreams of players who hoped to make their mark in the most competitive basketball league in the world. Equipment bags lined the sidelines, water bottles stood at attention, and the familiar sound of basketballs bouncing created a rhythm that spoke to the very soul of the game. Ranturo, the established veterans and coaching staff, there was a palpable sense of reverence mixed with curiosity. How would the greatest player of all time adapt to a team that hadn't tasted playoff success in years? How would his legendary competitiveness mesh with a roster that was still finding its identity? These questions lingered in the air like morning mist, waiting to be answered by the actions that would unfold on this particular Tuesday afternoon. The locker room conversations had been subdued in the days leading up to this moment. Veterans like Kyle Arnold and Timothy Roth had spoken in hushed tones about what it meant to share the court with a living legend. They understood the magnitude of the situation, the historical significance of playing alongside someone who had redefined what it meant to be clutch, what it meant to will your team to victory when everything seemed lost. Their respect wasn't just for Jordan's past accomplishments, but for the dedication and work ethic that had sustained those achievements over more than a decade of excellence. But not everyone in that locker room carried the same perspective. And that's where our story takes its most crucial turn. Among the mix of seasoned professionals and hopeful newcomers was a young player whose talent had earned him a spot on the roster, but whose wisdom had yet to catch up with his athletic ability. This player, let's call him Isaiah Allen, possessed the kind of raw skill that made scouts take notice and the kind of confidence that sometimes crossed the line into arrogance. Isaiah had been drafted just 2 years prior, selected in the second round by a team that saw potential in his explosive first step and his ability to score from multiple positions on the court. At 22 years old, he represented the new generation of basketball players who had grown up watching Jordan's highlights on repeat, but who also believed that the game had evolved beyond what any single player from a previous era could comprehend. His social media presence was carefully curated to showcase his lifestyle, his training regimen, and his belief that he belonged among the elite players in the league. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with a lean but muscular frame, Isaiah carried himself with the swagger of someone who had never truly faced adversity on a basketball court. His college career had been marked by individual accolades and highlight reel plays that made him a fan favorite. but team success had been more elusive. Still, he believed that his time in the NBA would be different, that his individual brilliance would translate into the kind of success that had eluded him in his amateur career. What Isaiah didn't fully grasp was the difference between talent and greatness, between individual skill and the kind of leadership that elevates everyone around you. He had studied film of Jordan's games, sure, but he had focused primarily on the moves, the shots, the athletic displays that could be broken down and analyzed from a technical standpoint. What he had missed were the subtle moments of leadership, the way Jordan's presence changed the energy in a building, the psychological warfare that happened long before the ball was even tipped off. In the days leading up to this fateful practice, Isaiah had been particularly vocal about his views on the current state of basketball. During lunch breaks and casual conversations with teammates, he would hold court with opinions about how the game had evolved, how modern players were more athletic, more skilled, and more versatile than their predecessors. He spoke with the certainty of youth, backed by statistics and analytics that seemed to support his worldview. "The game is different now," Isaiah would say, gesturing emphatically as he made his points. "Players today are stronger, faster, and they understand the game on a level that just wasn't possible back in the day. The science of training, the understanding of nutrition, the way we study film and break down tendencies, it's all evolved to a point where comparing eras doesn't even make sense anymore." His teammates would nod politely, some agreeing with certain points while others remained skeptical. Players like Jeffrey Owens and Paul Hansen, who had been in the league longer, understood that basketball was as much about intangibles as it was about measurable skills. They had seen plenty of talented players flame out because they couldn't handle the mental aspects of the game, the pressure, the constant scrutiny that came with playing at the highest level. But Isaiah was just getting started with his theories about basketball evolution. He would pull up advanced statistics on his phone, showing how modern players shot a higher percentage from three-point range, how they were more efficient with their possessions, how they understood spacing and ball movement in ways that previous generations had not. To him, these numbers told a clear story about the progression of the game, and he couldn't understand why people continued to romanticize players from earlier eras. "Look at the numbers," he would insist, scrolling through various websites that tracked every conceivable basketball statistic. "Today's players are shooting better percentages from everywhere on the court. They're more versatile, more complete. A guy like me can handle the ball, shoot from anywhere, defend multiple positions, and make plays for my teammates. That wasn't as common 20 years ago." The conversations would sometimes grow heated, especially when Isaiah would make broad generalizations about how players from previous eras would struggle to adapt to the modern game. He seemed genuinely convinced that athleticism and skill development had reached levels that would make even the greatest players from previous generations appear outdated by comparison. It was this mindset that set the stage for what would become one of the most memorable moments in Washington Wizards practice history. As the weeks passed and Jordan continued to integrate himself into the team's system, Isaiah watched from a distance with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. He saw an aging player who still possessed tremendous skill, but who clearly wasn't the same athlete who had dominated the league throughout the 1990s. Jordan's jumper was still pure, his basketball IQ was obviously off the charts, and his competitiveness was immediately apparent to anyone who spent 5 minutes around him. But Isaiah focused on what he perceived as limitations rather than strengths. During individual workouts, Isaiah would sometimes catch glimpses of Jordan's preparation routine, and he couldn't help but form opinions about what he observed. He saw a player who relied heavily on mid-range jump shots in an era where the three-point line was becoming increasingly important. He saw someone whose athleticism, while still impressive for his age, was clearly diminished from the levels that had made him famous. Most importantly, he saw someone who represented a style of basketball that Isaiah believed was becoming obsolete. These observations fed into Isaiah's growing confidence that he could not only hold his own against the legend, but potentially expose the gap between past greatness and present reality. He began to imagine scenarios where he would showcase his speed advantage, his improved shooting range, his better understanding of modern basketball concepts. In his mind, it wasn't about disrespecting Jordan's legacy. It was about proving that the game had evolved beyond what any single player from a previous era could fully comprehend. The coaching staff had been carefully managing the integration of Jordan into team practices, understanding that his presence would naturally create additional attention and pressure for everyone involved. Head coach Aaron Berry had played professionally himself and understood the delicate balance required to help a returning legend find his role while maintaining team chemistry. Berry had been watching Isaiah closely, noting both his obvious talent and his sometimes problematic attitude toward veteran leadership. Assistant Berry had spoken privately with several players about expectations and responsibilities, emphasizing that everyone would need to adjust their games to accommodate Jordan's presence while still maintaining their own identity as players. He had been particularly pointed in conversations with younger players, reminding them that Jordan's decision to return wasn't about proving anything to critics, but about his love for the game and his desire to help the organization reach new heights. But Isaiah seemed to interpret these conversations differently than his teammates. Where others heard messages about respect and learning opportunities, he heard challenges to prove himself worthy of sharing the court with a legend. His competitive nature, which had served him well throughout his basketball career, began to manifest itself in ways that concerned some of the more experienced players and coaches. During team meetings, Isaiah would sometimes ask pointed questions about offensive systems and defensive schemes, often with an underlying suggestion that more modern approaches might be more effective. He would reference plays and strategies that he had seen other teams implement successfully, usually teams with younger, more athletic rosters. While his input wasn't necessarily wrong, the timing and tone of his suggestions sometimes rubbed people the wrong way, particularly when they seemed designed to highlight perceived shortcomings in the team's current approach. The tension had been building for weeks, percolating beneath the surface of what appeared to be normal team chemistry and preparation. The players had begun to notice Isaiah's attitude, and some had even approached him privately to suggest that he might want to reconsider his approach to team dynamics. But these well-intentioned conversations seemed to only reinforce Isaiah's belief that his teammates were too intimidated by Jordan's reputation to embrace the kind of progress that the game demanded. As the calendar moved deeper into the preseason, practice intensity began to increase. The coaching staff started implementing more competitive drills, full-court scrimmages, and situational basketball that would prepare the team for the rigors of regular season play. It was during these more intense sessions that the true personalities of players began to emerge, and it became increasingly clear that a confrontation between Isaiah's modern confidence and Jordan's legendary competitiveness was becoming inevitable. The practice facility seemed to sense the growing tension, as if the very walls were anticipating something significant. Equipment managers went about their routines with extra attention to detail, making sure every ball was properly inflated, every piece of equipment was in its designated place. The training staff prepared for what they hoped would be another routine practice session, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something different was in the air that day. Jordan himself had been observing the team dynamics with the keen eye of someone who had spent his entire career reading people and situations. He noticed Isaiah's body language during team meetings, the way the young player would roll his eyes or shake his head when certain concepts were discussed. He observed how Isaiah interacted with teammates, often positioning himself as someone who understood the game on a level that others didn't fully appreciate. Most importantly, he sensed the underlying disrespect that Isaiah seemed to feel toward players from previous generations. For Jordan, this situation wasn't entirely unfamiliar. Throughout his career, he had encountered countless players who believed they could intimidate him, outplay him, or somehow diminish his impact on the game. Each of these encounters had served as fuel for the competitive fire that had driven him to 6 championships and numerous individual accolades. Now at 39 years old, and in a very different phase of his career, he was confronting a new type of challenger, not someone who simply wanted to beat him, but someone who seemed to believe that his entire era of basketball excellence was irrelevant. The stage was set for a confrontation that would go far beyond basketball skills or athletic ability. This was about respect for the game's history, understanding the difference between individual talent and championship mentality, and learning that greatness isn't defined by era, but by the ability to rise to every challenge, regardless of circumstances. The practice that was about to unfold would serve as a masterclass in competitive excellence, a reminder that some lessons can only be learned through direct experience, and a demonstration of why Michael Jordan's name would forever be synonymous with basketball greatness, as players began to arrive for what they assumed would be another routine practice session. None of them could have predicted that they were about to witness one of the most memorable moments in basketball history. The combination of youth versus experience, modern confidence versus proven greatness, and individual talent versus championship mentality was about to create a perfect storm that would leave everyone in that gymnasium with a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. The scene was set. The players were taking their positions, and somewhere in that mix of routine preparation and growing tension, history was preparing to unfold in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. What happened next would not only define the relationship between a cocky rookie and a legendary veteran, but it would also serve as a timeless reminder about the importance of respecting greatness regardless of when it was achieved. The moment that would forever change Isaiah Allen's understanding of basketball greatness began with something as simple as a defensive drill. Coach Aaron Berry had called for a standard 3-on-3 half-court exercise, the kind of routine basketball activity that teams run thousands of times throughout a season. Players were rotating through different combinations, working on communication, help defense, and the kind of fundamental basketball concepts that form the foundation of successful team play. The gym echoed with the familiar sounds of sneakers squeaking against hardwood, the rhythmic bounce of basketballs, and the occasional sharp blast of a whistle directing players to adjust their positioning or intensity. Michael Jordan had been moving through these drills with his characteristic attention to detail, demonstrating the kind of preparation habits that had sustained his excellence throughout his legendary career. Even at 39, his movements were deliberate and precise, each step calculated to maximize efficiency while minimizing wasted energy. He communicated constantly with his teammates, calling out screens, directing rotations, and providing the kind of veteran leadership that younger players often took years to develop. His presence on the court was commanding, without being overbearing, the natural authority of someone who had been in every possible basketball situation and emerged victorious more often than not. Isaiah Allen had been watching these interactions. With growing impatience, his confidence building with each passing minute. He had performed well in the earlier drills, showcasing the speed and athleticism that had made him an attractive prospect coming out of college. His jumper had been falling consistently, his defensive rotations had been sharp, and he had made several impressive plays that drew nods of approval from the coaching staff. In his mind, he was demonstrating exactly the kind of modern basketball skills that he believed represented the evolution of the game beyond what previous generations had been able to achieve. The fateful moment arrived when Coach Berry called for a specific defensive scenario, one designed to test communication and help defense in transition situations. The drill required players to rotate through different positions, with some acting as offensive threats, while others worked on defensive positioning and recovery. It was during this routine exercise that Isaiah found himself matched up directly against Jordan for the first time in practice, a one-on-one situation that would test not just their respective skills, but their understanding of what basketball excellence truly meant. As the two players faced each other at the top of the key, the energy in the gym shifted perceptibly. Other players began to take notice, their own drills becoming secondary to the drama that was beginning to unfold just a few feet away. The coaching staff exchanged glances, recognizing that this moment had been building for weeks and that they were about to witness something significant. Even the equipment managers and training staff found reasons to pause their activities and focus their attention on the developing situation. Jordan took his position with the casual confidence of someone who had faced every type of defensive challenge imaginable. His stance was relaxed but ready, his eyes focused not just on Isaiah, but on the entire court around him, reading angles and spacing with the kind of court vision that had made him legendary. He wasn't trying to intimidate or showboat. He was simply preparing to play basketball at the level that had defined his entire career. The ball felt natural in his hands, an extension of his will that had delivered countless clutch performances throughout his time in the league. Isaiah, meanwhile, was practically vibrating with anticipation. This was his moment to prove everything he had been saying about the evolution of basketball, his opportunity to demonstrate that modern players possessed advantages that even the greatest players from previous eras couldn't overcome. He crouched into his defensive stance with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed he was about to make a statement that would resonate throughout the entire organization. His confidence wasn't entirely misplaced. He was quicker than Jordan, younger, and possessed the kind of lateral movement that had made him effective against college competition. The first possession began innocuously enough, with Jordan simply probing the defense, testing Isaiah's positioning and reaction time. He used a series of subtle jab steps and shoulder fakes, the kind of fundamental moves that had been perfected through decades of practice and game experience. Isaiah responded well initially, staying low, maintaining proper defensive position, and forcing Jordan to work for any offensive advantage. For a moment, it appeared that the young player's confidence might be justified, that his speed and modern defensive techniques might indeed present challenges for the aging legend. But what Isaiah failed to understand was that Jordan wasn't simply trying to score on the first possession. He was gathering information, reading Isaiah's tendencies, understanding his strengths and weaknesses in a way that only comes from years of studying opponents and adapting to different challenges. Jordan was essentially downloading Isaiah's entire defensive profile in real time, processing information that would allow him to exploit weaknesses that the young player didn't even know he possessed. As the drill continued, Jordan began to implement subtle adjustments to his approach. He started using Isaiah's aggressiveness against him, employing pump fakes and change-of-pace moves that caused the younger player to overcommit to defensive positions. Jordan's footwork became more deliberate, his positioning more strategic, and his shot selection more calculated, What had started as a simple defensive drill was beginning to transform into a masterclass in basketball intelligence and situational awareness. Isaiah, meanwhile, was beginning to feel the first stirrings of frustration. Despite his best efforts, Jordan was finding ways to create scoring opportunities that seemed to come from nowhere. The moves weren't particularly flashy or athletic, but they were devastatingly effective, the result of decades spent perfecting the art of scoring against elite-level competition. Each basket seemed to come easier than the last, as Jordan's understanding of Isaiah's defensive tendencies grew more complete with every possession. It was during this sequence of successful, offensive possessions that Isaiah made the mistake that would define the rest of the practice session. Frustrated by his inability to contain Jordan's scoring and convinced that he was being beaten by outdated techniques rather than superior skill, Isaiah decided to voice his opinion in a way that would immediately escalate the situation beyond simple basketball competition. "Come on, man," Isaiah said with a dismissive laugh that carried across the suddenly quiet gymnasium. "This old-school stuff might have worked back in your day, but basketball has evolved. Players today are too fast, too strong, too smart for these basic moves to be effective anymore." The words hung in the air like a challenge that couldn't be ignored. Other players stopped their drills entirely, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The coaching staff exchanged concerned glances, recognizing that the situation had just crossed a line from competitive basketball into something much more personal and potentially explosive. Even the maintenance staff, who had been going about their routines in the background, found themselves drawn to the drama that was unfolding at center court. Jordan's response was immediate but measured, the kind of controlled intensity that had defined his approach to challenges throughout his career. He didn't raise his voice or display any outward signs of anger, but everyone in the gymnasium could sense the shift in his demeanor. His eyes locked onto Isaiah's with the kind of focus that had intimidated opponents for more than a decade, and when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had nothing left to prove, but everything to teach. "Is that right?" Jordan asked, his tone deceptively casual but loaded with implications that everyone present could feel. "You think the game has evolved beyond what I can handle? You think modern players are too advanced for what I bring to the court?" Isaiah, emboldened by what he interpreted as Jordan's calm reaction and still convinced that his point was valid, decided to double down on his position. "Look, no disrespect to what you accomplished back then, but the game is different. Now, players are more athletic, more skilled, more complete. The strategies are more sophisticated, the training is more advanced, and the competition is at a level that just didn't exist when you were in your prime." The young player gestured around the gymnasium as if the modern facility itself proved his point about basketball evolution. "This isn't personal, it's just facts. The game has moved beyond what any single player from 20 years ago could fully understand or adapt to. That's not a knock on you specifically, it's just the reality of how sports progress over time." What Isaiah failed to recognize was that he had just challenged not only Jordan's current abilities, but the very foundation of everything that had made him the greatest player in basketball history. He had essentially argued that Jordan's 6 championships, 5 MVP awards, and countless clutch performances were products of a less sophisticated era rather than demonstrations of transcendent talent and competitive will. In doing so, he had awakened something in Jordan that had been dormant since his return to the game, a competitive fire that had been waiting for exactly this kind of provocation. Jordan's smile was barely perceptible, but those who knew him well recognized it as the same expression he had worn before some of his most legendary performances. It was the look of someone who had just been given the perfect motivation to demonstrate why greatness transcends eras, why championship mentality cannot be taught or replicated, and why some players become legends while others remain footnotes in basketball history. "All right then," Jordan said quietly, his voice carrying across the now silent gymnasium with crystal clarity. "Let's see if this old-school player can keep up with modern basketball." The transformation that followed was immediate and absolute. Jordan's entire demeanor changed from casual practice mode to the kind of focused intensity that had defined his most memorable performances. His posture straightened, his movements became more deliberate, and his eyes took on the kind of competitive fire that had made him famous for rising to every challenge, regardless of the circumstances or stakes involved. The other players in the gymnasium recognized the shift immediately. Veterans like Kyle Arnold and Timothy Roth had seen footage of Jordan in this mode, but witnessing it in person was an entirely different experience. They could feel the energy in the building change, as if the very air had become charged with competitive electricity. Even players who had been going through their own drills found themselves drawn to what was about to unfold, understanding instinctively that they were about to witness something special. Coach Aaron Berry made a quick decision to halt all other activities and focus everyone's attention on what was developing between Jordan and Isaiah. He understood that this moment could serve as a teaching opportunity for the entire team, a demonstration of what separated great players from good ones, and a reminder of why respecting the game's history was essential for any player hoping to achieve lasting success. "Everyone gather around," Berry called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who recognized the significance of the moment. "We're going to run some competitive drills, and I want everyone to pay attention to what happens when you challenge greatness." As players formed a circle around the court, the atmosphere became electric with anticipation. Isaiah was still confident in his abilities, still convinced that his speed and modern techniques would allow him to prove his point about basketball evolution. He had no idea that he was about to receive an education in competitive excellence that would change his understanding of what it meant to be great at basketball. Jordan took his position at the top of the key once again, but this time everything about his approach was different. His movements were more purposeful, his focus more intense, and his entire presence more commanding. He wasn't just preparing to play basketball. He was preparing to deliver a lesson about respect, greatness, and the timeless nature of competitive excellence that would resonate far beyond this single practice session. The stage was set for a demonstration that would become legendary within the organization, a reminder that some fires never truly die, and a masterclass in what it means to respond to disrespect with the kind of performance that defines careers and creates lasting legacies. What happened next would not only humble a cocky rookie, but it would also serve as a powerful reminder to everyone present about why Michael Jordan's name would forever be synonymous with basketball greatness. What unfolded over the next 30 minutes would be remembered by everyone present as one of the most dominant individual performances they had ever witnessed on a basketball court. Michael Jordan, awakened from the casual approach he had taken to practice sessions, unleashed a display of competitive excellence that reminded everyone why champions are made of different material than ordinary players. The transformation was so complete, so overwhelming, that it seemed as if a different person had taken control of Jordan's body, someone who existed purely to demonstrate the difference between talent and greatness. The first possession after Isaiah's disrespectful comments set the tone for everything that would follow. Jordan received the ball at the top of the key, and instead of the probing, methodical approach he had used earlier, he immediately went to work with the kind of intensity that had defined his most memorable performances. His first move was a simple jab step to the right, followed by a quick crossover that sent Isaiah stumbling backward as he tried to recover his defensive position. The move itself wasn't particularly flashy, but the precision and timing were perfect, executed with the kind of muscle memory that comes from thousands of hours of practice and countless game situations. Before Isaiah could fully regain his balance, Jordan was already elevating for a mid-range jumper, his form textbook perfect as he released the ball with the confidence of someone who had made similar shots in far more pressure-packed situations. The ball traced a perfect arc through the air before swishing through the net with a sound that seemed to echo longer than physics should have allowed. It was a simple basket, technically speaking, but everyone in the gymnasium understood that they had just witnessed the beginning of something special. Isaiah's confidence, which had been so prominent just moments before, began to show its first cracks. He had expected to be beaten occasionally. Jordan was still a skilled player after all, but the ease with which the shot had been created and executed suggested that perhaps his assessment of modern defensive advantages had been somewhat optimistic. Still, he was determined to prove his point, convinced that one basket didn't invalidate his broader argument about basketball evolution and the advantages that contemporary players possessed. The second possession was even more devastating than the first. Jordan began with a series of subtle fakes and movements that seemed almost casual, as if he were simply warming up rather than engaging in serious competition. Isaiah bit on the first fake, overcommitting to his left and leaving himself vulnerable to a drive in the opposite direction. Jordan exploited the opening immediately, taking 2 quick dribbles toward the basket before pulling up for another mid-range jumper that found nothing but net. The pattern that was emerging became clear to everyone except Isaiah himself. Jordan wasn't relying on superior athleticism or modern training techniques to create his advantages. Instead, he was using decades of experience, basketball intelligence, and an understanding of human psychology that came from facing every type of defender imaginable throughout his legendary career. Each move was calculated to exploit specific weaknesses in Isaiah's defensive approach, weaknesses that the young player didn't even realize he possessed. By the third possession, other players in the gymnasium had stopped their own activities, entirely drawn to the unfolding demonstration like witnesses to a masterclass in competitive excellence. Veterans like Jeffrey Owens and Paul Hansen exchanged knowing glances, recognizing the signs of Jordan entering what teammates had once called the zone, a mental state where basketball became less about physical ability and more about pure competitive will manifested through perfect execution. Jordan's third basket came via a fadeaway jumper that seemed to defy both physics and logic. Isaiah had played perfect defense according to every modern coaching manual, maintaining proper position, contesting the shot, and using his length and athleticism to maximum advantage. But Jordan simply rose higher than seemed possible for a 39-year-old player, created separation that shouldn't have existed, and released a shot with such perfect rotation and arc that the outcome never seemed in doubt. The shot swished through the net with the same devastating finality as the previous 2, but this time, Isaiah's expression revealed the first signs of genuine concern. He was beginning to understand that he wasn't simply being outplayed by superior skill. He was being systematically dismantled by someone who understood basketball on a level that transcended physical advantages. Every fundamental principle of defense that he had learned throughout his career was being rendered useless by Jordan's combination of experience, intelligence, and what could only be described as basketball genius. Coach Aaron Berry watched the developing situation with the fascination of someone witnessing basketball history unfold in real time. He had seen countless talented players throughout his coaching career, but what Jordan was demonstrating went beyond talent into the realm of pure competitive artistry. Each basket wasn't just a score, it was a statement about the difference between good players and great ones, between individual skill and championship mentality. The fourth possession introduced a new element to Jordan's offensive arsenal: psychological warfare. As he approached the top of the key, Jordan began talking to Isaiah in the kind of quiet, conversational tone that opponents throughout the 1990s had learned to fear. His words weren't meant to be heard by others in the gymnasium. They were delivered with the precision of a surgeon, designed to undermine Isaiah's confidence while simultaneously demonstrating the mental aspects of basketball excellence that couldn't be taught in any training program. "You said the game evolved past what I could handle," Jordan said as he dribbled casually, his eyes never leaving Isaiah's face. "But basketball isn't about evolution, it's about execution when it matters most." With that, Jordan launched into a move that seemed to unfold in slow motion, despite being executed at full speed. He started with a simple crossover dribble that drew Isaiah slightly to his left, then immediately reversed direction with a behind-the-back dribble that created just enough space for a step-back jumper. The shot was released from an awkward angle, with Isaiah's hand directly in his face, but it sailed through the air with the confidence of someone who had made similar shots to win championships. The ball swished through the net once again, and this time, the sound seemed to reverberate through the gymnasium with an almost musical quality. Players who had been watching in respectful silence began to murmur among themselves, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Some pulled out their phones to record what was happening, understanding instinctively that this was the kind of moment that would be talked about for years to come. Isaiah's frustration was becoming more apparent with each successful Jordan basket. His defensive intensity increased dramatically, with more aggressive positioning and quicker reactions to Jordan's initial movements. But rather than disrupting Jordan's rhythm, Isaiah's increased desperation seemed to provide additional fuel for the legendary competitor's fire. Jordan began to anticipate Isaiah's adjustments before they happened, staying one step ahead of every defensive modification the young player attempted to implement. The fifth possession showcased Jordan's ability to score in ways that seemed to violate the laws of basketball physics. Isaiah played what appeared to be perfect defense, staying low, maintaining proper position, and forcing Jordan into what should have been a difficult shot attempt. But Jordan simply elevated over the defense as if Isaiah weren't there, hanging in the air longer than seemed possible before releasing a shot that traced a perfect arc into the basket. As the ball swished through the net for the fifth consecutive time, something shifted in the atmosphere of the gymnasium. What had started as a competitive drill between two players had transformed into something approaching basketball mythology. Other players were no longer just watching. They were studying, trying to understand how someone could make scoring look so effortless against determined athletic defense. Timothy Roth, who had been observing from the sideline, found himself shaking his head in amazement. He had played against some of the best players in the league throughout his career, but what Jordan was demonstrating seemed to exist on a different plane entirely. Each basket was a reminder that greatness couldn't be measured solely through statistics or athletic testing, that there were intangible qualities that separated legends from everyone else who had ever played the game. The sixth possession introduced an element of showmanship that elevated the performance from dominant to legendary. Jordan began with a series of dribbling moves that seemed designed more to entertain than to create scoring opportunities, a display of ball-handling skills that reminded everyone present that his greatness had never been limited to scoring ability alone. He weaved the ball between his legs, behind his back, and around his body, with the casual confidence of someone performing a routine warm-up exercise. Isaiah responded to the apparent showboating by increasing his defensive pressure even further, reaching and gambling for steals that Jordan anticipated and avoided with ease. The increased aggression only served to create more opportunities for Jordan to exploit, as the young player's desperation began to compromise his defensive fundamentals. Jordan used Isaiah's over-aggressive approach against him, employing subtle changes of pace and direction that sent the defender stumbling in the wrong direction. The basket that followed was perhaps the most devastating yet, a simple pull-up jumper that came after Jordan had essentially danced around Isaiah's aggressive defensive attempts. The shot was released with such casual confidence that it seemed almost disrespectful, as if Jordan were demonstrating that he could score at will, regardless of what defensive approach his opponent chose to employ. As the ball swished through the net for the sixth consecutive time, the silence in the gymnasium became almost overwhelming. Other players stood transfixed, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would become part of basketball lore within the organization. This wasn't just about Jordan proving a point to one disrespectful rookie. This was about demonstrating the timeless nature of competitive excellence and the qualities that separate champions from everyone else. Isaiah's body language had changed dramatically over the course of these 6 possessions. His initial confidence had been replaced by a growing realization that he was completely outmatched, not just in terms of skill, but in understanding what basketball competition truly meant at the highest level. His shoulders sagged slightly with each successful Jordan basket, and his defensive positioning became more hesitant as he struggled to find any approach that might slow down the relentless scoring barrage. The 7th possession would prove to be the most psychologically devastating of all. Jordan approached the top of the key with the same casual confidence that had characterized his entire performance. But this time, he stopped his dribble about 20 feet from the basket and simply stood there, the ball resting comfortably in his hands as he stared directly at Isaiah. "You want to see evolution?" Jordan asked, loud enough for everyone in the gymnasium to hear clearly. "This is evolution. This is what happens when talent meets the will to be great when it matters most." With that declaration, Jordan launched a shot from well beyond the three-point line, a distance that would be considered a difficult attempt even in the modern era that Isaiah had claimed was so superior to previous generations. The ball left Jordan's hands with perfect rotation and arc, sailing through the air as if guided by some invisible force toward its inevitable destination. The shot swished through the net with a finality that seemed to end not just the possession, but the entire debate about basketball evolution and relevance. 7 possessions, 7 made shots, and a demonstration of competitive excellence that had left everyone in the gymnasium speechless. Isaiah stood frozen in place, his confidence completely shattered, his arguments about modern basketball advantages exposed as the shallow observations of someone who had confused physical gifts with basketball greatness. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the ball bouncing on the hardwood floor, a rhythmic reminder of what had just transpired. Other players began to move closer, drawn by the magnitude of what they had witnessed and the understanding that they had just seen something that would be remembered long after their own playing careers had ended. Jordan retrieved the ball calmly, his expression unchanged, despite having just delivered one of the most dominant individual performances in practice history. He walked over to where Isaiah stood, still struggling to process what had just happened, and extended his hand in a gesture that somehow managed to be both respectful and definitive. "The game doesn't evolve past greatness," Jordan said quietly, his words carrying the weight of 6 championships and countless clutch performances. "It just gives greatness new ways to express itself." The lesson had been delivered with devastating effectiveness, but what happened next would determine whether it had been truly learned. The immediate aftermath of Jordan's 7 consecutive baskets created a silence in the gymnasium that seemed to stretch far beyond the physical confines of the building. Isaiah Allen stood motionless, his hand still extended from the handshake with Jordan, his mind struggling to process not just what had happened, but what it meant for everything he thought he understood about basketball, competition, and his own place in the hierarchy of the game. The confidence that had defined his personality for years had been systematically dismantled over the course of 7 possessions, replaced by a humbling awareness that greatness operated on levels he had never even considered. The other players in the gymnasium remained frozen in their positions, as if moving might somehow disturb the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. Veterans like Kyle Arnold and Timothy Roth had seen dominant individual performances throughout their careers. But what Jordan had just demonstrated transcended normal basketball excellence and entered the realm of competitive artistry. Each shot had been a masterpiece of timing, technique, and mental fortitude, but collectively they had formed a symphony of greatness that reminded everyone present why some players become legends while others fade into obscurity. Coach Aaron. Barry was the first to break the silence, but his words came slowly, as if he was still processing the implications of what had unfolded on his court. "That," he said, addressing the entire team while his eyes remained fixed on the spot where Jordan had just delivered his final shot, "is what championship mentality looks like. That's what happens when you challenge someone who has spent their entire career proving that greatness has no expiration date." Jordan himself appeared completely unaffected by the magnitude of his performance, as if making 7 consecutive shots against elite-level defense was simply another day at the office. He began walking toward the sideline with the same casual demeanor he had displayed throughout practice, but everyone present understood that what they had just witnessed was anything but routine. His calm acceptance of his own excellence was perhaps the most intimidating aspect of the entire demonstration, a reminder that legends don't celebrate dominance because, for them, dominance is simply the expected outcome. Isaiah finally found his voice, but when he spoke, the words came out as barely more than a whisper. I don't understand how." He trailed off, unable to complete the thought, because the very foundation of his basketball worldview had been shaken. Everything he had believed about modern advantages, athletic evolution, and the irrelevance of previous eras had been exposed as the shallow observations of someone who had confused physical gifts with competitive greatness. Jordan paused in his walk toward the sideline and turned back to face the young player who had challenged his relevance. His expression was neither angry nor smug. Instead, it carried the patient wisdom of someone who had learned these lessons through decades of competition and who understood that teaching moments were opportunities to elevate everyone involved, rather than simply to dominate for the sake of dominance. "You want to understand?" Jordan asked, his voice carrying across the silent gymnasium with crystal clarity. "Then let me explain something that no amount of modern training or advanced analytics can teach you. Basketball isn't about being faster or stronger or more athletic than your opponent. It's about being better when it matters most. It's about understanding that greatness isn't a physical attribute. It's a choice you make every single time you step on the court." He walked closer to Isaiah, but his words were clearly intended for everyone present, a masterclass in competitive philosophy that would resonate far beyond this single practice session. "You said the game evolved past what I could handle, but you missed the most important point. The fundamentals of greatness never change. The will to win, the refusal to accept defeat, the ability to perform under pressure, these aren't things that get outdated, they're timeless." Jordan gestured toward the basket where he had just made 7 consecutive shots, each one a testament to the principles he was now articulating. "Every shot I just made was built on fundamentals that were established decades before I was even born. The footwork, the follow-through, the mental approach, none of that is modern or old school. It's just basketball at its purest level, executed by someone who refuses to accept anything less than excellence. The teaching moment was having a profound impact not just on Isaiah, but on every player in the gymnasium. Younger players like John McCarthy and Andrew Liu were absorbing lessons about competitive mentality that would influence their approach to the game for years to come. They were learning that talent without the will to be great was just potential energy that would never be converted into meaningful achievement. Isaiah's transformation was visible in real time, his posture changing from defensive defiance to genuine humility as he began to understand the magnitude of what he had just experienced. I believed that because the game had changed, that because players today have advantages that didn't exist before. He struggled to find words that could adequately express the shift in his understanding. You thought that progress meant the past became irrelevant, Jordan said, completing the thought with the kind of insight that came from having faced similar challenges throughout his career. But that's not how excellence works. Excellence builds on the foundation of those who came before, adding new elements while never abandoning the core principles that make greatness possible. Jordan began walking in a slow circle around the gathered players, his movement creating a natural classroom atmosphere that drew everyone into the discussion. The game has evolved. You're right about that. Players today are more athletic, training methods are more advanced, and the strategic understanding of basketball has definitely improved. But you made the mistake of thinking that these advances somehow invalidate what came before. He stopped directly in front of Isaiah, his eyes locking onto the young players with an intensity that was both challenging and supportive. What you just witnessed wasn't old-school basketball beating modern defense. It was timeless basketball principles executed at the highest level. The shots I made weren't possible because I'm stronger or faster than you. They were possible because I've spent decades learning how to be great when being good isn't enough. The lesson was expanding beyond basketball technique into broader principles of life and success that resonated with everyone present. Every generation thinks they've figured out something that previous generations missed, Jordan continued. But true greatness isn't about being different from those who came before. It's about being worthy of standing alongside them. Jeffrey Owens, who had been listening intently from the sideline, stepped forward with a question that captured what many of his teammates were thinking. How do you maintain that level of excellence when everyone expects you to fail? How do you respond to challenges like this without letting them affect your confidence or your approach to the game? Jordan's smile was barely perceptible, but it carried the weight of countless similar moments throughout his legendary career. Because challenges like this don't threaten my confidence. They fuel it. When someone tells me I'm not relevant anymore, or that the game has passed me by, they're giving me exactly the motivation I need to prove them wrong. That's what competition is really about. Finding ways to be great when people expect you to be ordinary. He gestured toward Isaiah, whose expression had changed completely over the course of the conversation. Isaiah didn't disrespect me when he said those things. He gave me an opportunity to demonstrate something that can't be taught in any training program or captured in any statistical analysis. He gave me a chance to show what happens when preparation meets opportunity and competitive will. The teaching moment was creating a transformation not just in Isaiah, but in the entire team dynamic. Players were beginning to understand that greatness wasn't about individual achievement, but about elevating everyone around you through example and leadership. They were witnessing firsthand how true champions respond to challenges, not with anger or defensiveness, but with performance that speaks louder than any words could ever accomplish. Isaiah stepped forward, his voice stronger now, but carrying a humility that had been completely absent from his earlier comments. "I owe you an apology," he said, addressing not just Jordan but the entire group. I thought I understood what basketball excellence meant, but I was measuring it by the wrong standards. I was so focused on physical advantages and modern techniques that I completely missed the mental and competitive aspects that actually determine who wins and who loses. Jordan nodded approvingly, recognizing the genuine nature of Isaiah's transformation. That's the first step toward real improvement, he said. Understanding that talent gets you to the table, but competitive will determines whether you eat or go hungry. Physical gifts are just the starting point. Greatness begins when you decide that being good enough isn't actually good enough. The conversation was creating ripple effects throughout the team as players began to reconsider their own approaches to competition and excellence. They were learning that respect for the game's history wasn't about living in the past, but about understanding the foundation upon which future greatness would be built. Coach Berry seized the moment to expand the lesson beyond individual competition into team dynamics and collective success. What happened here today isn't just about one player proving a point to another, he said, addressing the entire group. It's about understanding that excellence is contagious when it's approached with the right mentality. Michael didn't just score 7 baskets, he elevated the entire practice by demonstrating what's possible when you refuse to accept limitations. The practice session that followed was unlike anything the team had experienced before. Players approached every drill with increased intensity, better focus, and a deeper understanding of what it meant to compete at the highest level. Isaiah, in particular, seemed transformed, his defensive positioning more disciplined, his offensive decision-making more thoughtful, and his overall approach to the game more respectful of both teammates and opponents. As the session concluded, and players began making their way to the locker room, the conversations were filled with references to what they had just witnessed. Players were already creating nicknames for the performance, discussing the technical aspects of Jordan's shots and analyzing the psychological elements that had made the demonstration so devastating. Isaiah approached Jordan one final time before leaving the court, his demeanor completely different from the cocky confidence he had displayed earlier. "Thank you," he said simply, "not just for the lesson, but for the way you delivered it. You could have embarrassed me in front of everyone, but instead you turned it into something that made all of us better." Jordan's response carried the wisdom of someone who had learned that true greatness isn't about defeating others, but about inspiring them to reach levels they never thought possible. "The goal was never to embarrass you," he said. "The goal was to help you understand that greatness is always available to those who are willing to work for it. What happened today was just the beginning. Now you have to decide what you're going to do with what you learned." As players filtered out of the gymnasium, the stories were already beginning to take shape. What had started as a routine practice had become a defining moment in the organization's history, a reminder that legends aren't just created through championships and individual accolades, but through moments of competitive excellence that inspire everyone who witnesses them. The 7 consecutive baskets would be discussed and analyzed for years to come, but the real legacy of that afternoon wasn't found in the shots themselves, but in the transformation they had created. Isaiah Allen would go on to have a successful career, but he would always credit this moment as the day he learned the difference between talent and greatness. Other players would carry the lessons with them throughout their own careers, passing down the wisdom to future generations of athletes who needed to understand that respect isn't given, it's earned through performance when performance matters most. Years later, when players and coaches would gather to share stories about the greatest individual performances they had ever witnessed, this practice session would always be mentioned. Not because of the difficulty of the shots or the athletic brilliance displayed, but because of the way it had demonstrated that true greatness transcends eras, that competitive excellence never goes out of style, and that some lessons can only be learned through witnessing greatness in action. The story would spread beyond the organization, becoming part of basketball folklore that reminded everyone who heard it that legends aren't just players who achieved great things in the past. They're competitors who continue to inspire greatness in others long after their playing days have ended. And in that gymnasium on that Tuesday afternoon, Michael Jordan had once again proven why his name would forever be synonymous with everything that makes basketball beautiful, competitive, and eternally inspiring.